morning, afternoon, evening, uh, depending on where you are. Um, so glad to be part of this Parsha class and the learning that y'all generally do with Rabbi Kasher while he's away. Haven't gotten to be part of these learnings in quite a while, and so I know some of you, I know others of you a little bit, and maybe some of you I really haven't gotten to connect with. So um, in case you didn't know, that was a song called "What Is Love" by Hadaway from, I believe, 1993. Um, so maybe familiar to some of you. Oh, there we go. With thanks to Tzvi for starting us off with a little dance. We have a source sheet. We're going to be exploring a little bit about love today. Because it is in our parsha this week, as you'll see from the first source. Try not to go too far ahead. If you're willing to be on camera, that definitely would be my preference. I know some people are maybe multitasking, which I totally appreciate. I am currently doing the dishes, so I get it. Not well though. So we're going to explore a little bit of love, particularly love of God, because in this week's Parsha of Va'ed Hanan, we have Shema, the famous one line of Shema, followed by Ve'ahavta, a commandment to love God. Some good questions, some good commentary on that. And maybe we'll have a little bit of time, I think we'll have some time to expand a bit on our concept of love, other commandments of loving. I'm going to ask for people to read, even if you're not on camera. I would just love it if people would be participatory. That's my style. And also, as soon as you open the source sheet, or as soon as we start learning together, the texts are yours just as much as they are mine, or anyone else's. And so, y'all ready to jump in? If you will, put something in the chat. Anybody have a good question? Anyone have something you want to share? Just where are you holding today? Maybe some gratitude, maybe something you want to dedicate our learning to today. Something, someone. Maybe it's for somebody's healing, or maybe it's a celebration. Maybe it's you're marking something, so we get a chance to know each other, even in these little ways. And I get a little window into who you are and what you're thinking about today, as we study Torah together. So, a person you're thinking of, if there's anyone who's healing you'd like us to dedicate our learning to. All right, amen. Happy birthday to Kate. Belated. Ari, for your healing, to Hannah Mintz. Absolutely, beloved community member. Aliyah Bar Esther and Menachem Ben Lily. Leah, actually showing your true self to somebody. We'll celebrate that for sure. All right, friends. Who's going to start us off reading? Class will go way more interesting, way better. Fixing the internet connection. Amen. Man, if there's one thing that we have learned this past year and a half, it's the importance of some good internet, and how not to take that for granted. All right, someone start us off. The text in English, first text, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, or the Lord is one. David, sending you all blessings to Frank's family and friends, dedicating our learning to Frank's memory. So who's going to jump in and read? Yes, David, thank you so much.
You're reading Deuteronomy 6 right there?
Exactly, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9.
Okay. They usually put it on the screen, but I have it in front of me here. It's not on
okay.
But that's fine with me. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
Thank you so much. And we can do a screen share of the text in a moment. It's also nice to see faces, so we can do a little bit of both. We did share the link to the source sheet in the chat, and maybe Tzvi, if you don't mind sharing it again for anybody who joined in recently. Familiar, not familiar, yeah, generally familiar, right? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meodecha. So what is a really good question about this verse number 5? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Classic question, good question, or any question that you have at all. Might not be a classic question. Yeah, Paim.
So the English grammar is actually incorrect because there's no such thing as you shall. So does it translate as you will, or is it a commandment that you must, or in that sense?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, and it's definitely, it's a future looking. I'm not the grammar person, but I definitely know it's looking ahead, right? So is that you will, or is that you must, right? Shall, I think, tells us it's a must. And traditionally this is understood as a commandment, right? As a mitzvah, meaning a must. Right. So anyone have thoughts about that, questions? And feel free to use the chat. Physically raise your hand, just unmute. I'll hopefully see it. Let's assume it's a must. You must love God. Jump on in. Yes, Matt.
I guess the concept, what does it mean to love God? I think is the first, because among other things, I don't feel that that's the kind of relationship we've been seeing until now. Been seeing, maybe a little parentage, but really not a loving, because loving to me implies some sort of back and forth intimacy and give and take. And that's not what we've seen in general.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting. The question of what is love, right? As asked by 1993 hit by Hathaway, right? Like, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Also, we could go down that route. Don't have to, but what does it mean to love God, right? If we're being commanded to love God, and interestingly, that line itself does also say with all your heart, your soul, and your might, or your stuff, right? Or your strength. So maybe we're starting to get a little bit of something elaborated, but then you bring up this question of, defining love. Is love about a give and take, right? Is love about some sort of reciprocal something, even if it's not exactly even, right? Is that something we've seen yet in the Torah? Leah?
I have a little bit of different take on it. It's not, of course, not my original take. There's a God's search for man. I think it's completely reciprocal. That we are interacting we're asked to interact with God in order to do our part in the covenant. We are necessary, and our actions are necessary in order to move the whole project forward. And there are instances where I wouldn't say we're exactly equal, but we're certainly in dialogue with God.
Right. Yeah, and you're bringing us into action, which I think is really important, and covenant, right, and relationship, right? Covenant is a form of relationship. I think that's a really important point, right? There's something asked of us, but there's also something that God is giving in return. So there might be some reciprocal. There is a relation. There is give and take, right? Is the phrase that I'm looking for. All right, we're gonna go Alexandra, David, Randy, and then we're gonna keep going. So Alexandra first.
So this is my absolute favorite thing ever. But it wasn't always. And the reason it is my favorite thing ever is I learned from a Swami a mantra that I loved, but it was like going to the neighbor's house for dinner. I wanted to be able to find it in my own religion. And the mantra it translates to, I give all my love to the one in whom all things dwell and who dwells in all things. And I thought, that's really beautiful, but I want it in Hebrew somewhere. So where is it? And I was looking through the Psalms, and then finally it dawned on me that it's the Shema. And it didn't connect with me initially because I was mostly familiar with it from the liturgy, where the rabbis had inserted the line in between the two parts of God is one, and then love God with all of yourself and everything. So, but once I realized that, I took that part out of it in my own personal prayers. I took the dividing line out and focused on the God is one, God is everything, and love God. And I find it really, when I think about it like that, and I say the Shema that way with the idea of blasting love to whatever part of me needs healing, whatever part of someone else needs healing, whatever relationship is really pissing me off, whatever is challenging me, like I find it really transformational and very helpful. So this is my favorite thing ever.
Great. I picked a good day then, and a good text is great. At least one person's favorite text ever. Thank you, Alexandra. All right, and then David and Randy.
Okay, I'll be the bad guy. I'm not going to be so charitable. I see it strictly as a warning in the context of everything in Deuteronomy. It's Moses saying, he's using the word shall is actually kind of right, because it's like you better. And in the context of everything with Deuteronomy, that feels right. Now, being more charitable, or let's say reading into it more, we don't understand love, and we don't understand God. And just like some, parents love children, children love parents, no matter that unconditional part, it's the other reading is you don't understand God. You never will understand God. Keep reminding yourself that no matter what's coming down the track, love God.
Great. Right. So you just brought up a whole bunch of things, David. And I think, putting this in the context of Devarim, Deuteronomy is important, and sort of, and then the next paragraph of Shema that the rabbis added on, which does come from a different spot, is all of the and here's what will happen if you do the things you're supposed to do, and here's what will happen if you don't do the things that you're supposed to do, right? So that's helpful. That's good to have that context. You bring up knowing God, you bring up what is loving God anyway? I want to explore that question with us a little bit. And so I know I told Randy, you can jump in. Ari, I see your hand. If you want to hold your comment for now, that's great. Or you could put it in the chat. Everyone else, feel free to also put ideas in the chat, interact with one another, want to be in conversation. Okay, Randy. Oh, you are muted, Randy.
This is a good question for me because I'm really thinking about this a lot. What's it all mean? But I know, I was just kind of thinking when this originally came down at Sinai, there was a huge dose of fear. There was a lot of fireworks and thunder and lightning. And I don't know, I'm wondering how much you can really love something, somebody, some entity, if you're quaking. And, it doesn't sound like a free thing to me somehow, if you're afraid of something really terrible happening. If you don't, this feeds a little bit off of what Dave was just saying, but I'm just wondering, where do the people find their balance in all of this? Or, or is this just the terms of the relationship? How negotiable is all of this?
Right. And very interesting that you're bringing fear into the mix, because that is something the rabbis say, right? It is a greater level of serving God when it is out of love, me'ahava, as opposed to miyirah, right? Out of fear. So they recognize that's definitely in the mix, but wouldn't it be great to be able to sort of transcend that or go, into the realm of love? So really good topic to bring up. Okay, let's keep going. So nobody's clearly brought up one question that I always think about here. which is how are we commanded to love, right? Like even just that simple question, like what does it mean if it's like love is an emotion, right? And so it's kind of an interesting challenge that the text brings us. So can somebody maybe who hasn't spoken read to us? This is the commentary of Shadal, Shmuel David Lutzato, and I took the translation from and the text from Nechama Leibovitz. So with all your heart, can someone jump in, just unmute yourself and read?
I'm happy to read. It's Kate.
Go ahead.
With all your heart, since the divine Torah saw fit to speak of the language of humans and depict to us a God who has feelings, anger and desire, love and hate, it follows that humans must also be described as loving or hating God. For whoever sets the Lord always before them and is exclusively concerned with doing God's pleasure and observing God's commandments will be called the lover of God.
Okay, keep going just a little more.
Sure, the love of God is not a separate commandment, but an underlying principle of all the commandments. The love itself cannot be the subject of a command.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kate. So let's just take this a little bit at a time, right? So the question here is, how are we being commanded to love God? Like, how do we even do that? And it seems like Lutzato is actually saying, well, we kind of are and we kind of aren't. It's a ridiculous idea. You maybe wouldn't say ridiculous, but you know, we don't know how to love God because God is God, and there are limitations on that. And he's pointing out, look, the Torah describes God as, you know, one who has feelings, anger, desire, love, hate, right? And according to him anyway, that's not real, but that's in order for us to be able to process and understand and make sense of God within our limited capacity. And so therefore, the idea of us loving God is also, it's language being used to help us do our best to grasp something, right? But here's what he says: whoever sets the Lord always before them and is exclusively concerned with doing God's pleasure and observing God's commandments will be called the lover of God, right? So he's not, it's an interesting, sort of turning it into a little bit of a different idea. Love of God is not a separate commandment. Payam, you asked this question earlier, right? But an underlying principle of all the commandments. You can't command a person to love. So what does it mean? I'm going to stop the share and start the share, but that's the last idea. For him, we're not being commanded to love, but what are we being asked to do, or what is the challenge before us? And like I said, feel free to also use the chat if that's your preference. You can physically raise your hand. It'll be harder for me to see while I'm screen sharing. Yeah, Wayne.
Well, I guess I would say that instead of being commanded to love God, we're commanded to follow the commandments. And by doing so, we're expressing our love for God.
Okay, great, right? So we're taking this, he's taking this out of the realm of emotion and saying, of course, you can't, you know, be expected to feel a thing as an obligation, but instead we're focusing on mitzvot, right? And mitzvot, so this is an interesting line here. The love of God is not a separate commandment, but an underlying principle of the mitzvot. So it's not even just do mitzvot because that's an expression of love, right? But the mitzvot in some ways maybe have to be driven by love, right? Ari, your hand's still up?
Yeah, you kind of raised the question I was going to bring up before, but it would make, the first sentence would make a lot more sense to me if it was, you shall obey your God, right? That's something you can command. Certainly in modern America, certainly with romantic love, but even with not romantic love, we have a very hard time. Love for us is something very fleeting, right? You fall in love, you fall out of love. It's very hard to love someone on command. Someone, in fact, think about it, tells you to love them. Often we repulse from that. So I see what the rabbi in the commentary is saying, well, it's, you know, follow the commandments, but that's not what the text says. And the next sentence, with all your heart, with all your soul and all your might, to me, it signals, you know, you don't really, I mean, I suppose you could obey with all your heart, but again, reading in a modern American sense, the heart language and the acts prescribed upon it really are talking about love, not, or something, you know, take it out of, I mean, something really bone deep that's not really usually associated with, in our conceptions, you know, like, oh, follow, you know, do this rule, you know, no one says don't eat milk and meat with all your love, right? It doesn't make sense in that sense. So, or with all your heart, right? Like, it's something, to me it doesn't, but you know,
right.
Yeah.
But can it, right? Like, can we, and maybe you'll feel the answer is no, and that's totally fair. Can we see even something like the commandment to abstain from mixing milk and meat? Can we see in that love, right? Anybody? Yeah, Matt.
As someone who's not observant, yes, I could absolutely see love. For me, I see those kinds of commandments as making the world right. That there is this notion that holiness is things are where they should be. Things are separated the way they should be, and it's making the world right. And so, yes, you do that with love. And I will say, again, as someone who's not observant, I have met people for whom I think keeping kosher is an act of love for them, that they are feeling the same emotions of love when they are saying, I'm making sure that this meal is right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Whatever that right, some things it feels a little more obvious what right is, and some things might be a little bit more, you know, there's ritual right? There's between us and God, right? I just want to acknowledge, by the way, we're talking about God and love, love of God. Two things. One, I know that not everybody has the same beliefs about God or belief in God at all, and that's okay. I appreciate anybody and everybody joining into this conversation. You know, we're sort of doing you know, we're entering into the text, and the Torah does have us in relationship with God, right? With a God, with a particular, you know, concept of God, and no expectation that even people who are participating in the conversation have that same perspective or that same understanding. Should have said that from the outset. And I do want to make sure, you know, as we're going through this, you know, and as Ari started to do for us, is expanding, right? This isn't the only place that we're commanded to love in Torah. There are two others: Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, and ve'ahavtem et hager, to love the stranger, right? And so as we are talking about love and love of God and commandment to love, right, which happens now, which we see 3 times, I want us to be sort of holding in our minds also the neighbor and the stranger, or the fellow and the stranger, however, and the, you know, the other, however we want to define those, because I think it's important, right? I think whatever it is that we can understand about this commandment will help us expand our thinking about love between humans, all kinds of love. Go to Maggie.
Hi, so I had a really difficult relationship with God in terms of loving and following the commandments after my mother passed away 2 years ago. I don't think I had this hatred because he took that which I loved the most in the whole world. I mean, there was nothing compared to the love I had with my mother. But as time progressed and my relationship and the support I had with my community brought me back to understanding that my relationship with God is similar. And I have to say similar because there's nothing like the relationship I had with my mother. And so I see that he gives as much as he takes, and that is his or her way of showing love. And just like my mother gave me what she could, but she also took away when I was bad, when I was growing up, that's what I see as Hashem doing for us. And after her passing, I've continued to go through difficulties and testing of my love for Hashem, but yet I still pray and find myself needing that prayer and that community attachment. And I don't know if love is necessarily to love Hashem as Hashem, but to love community,
Right.
which is what he's given us so that we can sustain and be the people that we are today.
Right, right. Sort of also thinking a little bit more broadly about what does it mean to direct love toward God. So I'm going to go over to Hal and Kathy for a moment. Payam, I'm going to ask you to either type something in the chat or hold, and then because I want to keep going through these texts. But obviously, so much to say. It's such a, I think it's complicated, right? It's hard and complex, and God in any topic, there's so much to say about God, but especially love and God. Okay, Hal or Kathy.
So I guess what struck me, especially sort of bringing in the other examples of love, you know, your neighbor as yourself or the stranger, and then also God, you know, I mean, it just kind of said, well, what do we mean by love here, that all of these, you know, can use the same word? And I don't know, I mean, I guess the thing that maybe occurs to me is that it just means giving of yourself, or not centering yourself in these various relationships. And you know, I don't know where that gets you, but you know, it's sort of, you know, we have, I mean, love is such a loaded term, especially today. You know, the whole notion of romantic love is a fairly recent one in history. So it certainly wasn't there when the Bible was written.
Right.
It meant very different things. So I don't know. So maybe just sort of self-sacrifice, or just sort of not being primarily self-centered. So
yeah, placing someone else's needs in front of your own needs, right? Like, I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hold on, there was something. Might be gone, but it might come back. Hold on. Love, defining it. Oh, romantic love. In the Torah, what's interesting is, I think it was Ari who brought up the loving with all your heart, right? And Lev, heart, as we understand heart, is often the intellect or the mind when we're reading Torah or reading some of our like medieval texts. And so, you know, to see that as love, again, trying to define that, but with all of your mind, heart, your being, right? Your soul, your life. Also, what's that? Hard to define. And with all your stuff, right? And your strength and your will, your mind. So there's a lot in here that's like, what exactly? Not only is the love a little bit hard, but all the other stuff is kind of hard. Too, right? Okay, so we're gonna take that. And we're going to go into Rambam, into Sefer HaMitzvot, into positive commandments, right? So he's going, in that book, he just goes through mitzvah after mitzvah. And the third mitzvah that we are commanded is to love God. And then here's how we understand that: to meditate upon and closely examine God's mitzvot, commandments and works, right? Actions. Commandments and mitzvot translated here not great. So God's actions, right? God's utterances and God's commandments, right? And in order to understand God, through this understanding to achieve ecstasy, and this is the goal of the commandment to love God. And I would say, if we're not going to go with ecstasy, maybe we'll sort of like an enjoyment, right? A deep pleasure. So what this offers us is, well, what is the commandment Ve'ahavta saying? Well, there's a couple of steps, right? Payim, you're offering, and I see a lot of people really agree with this, and I think we'll see this more in our texts, that action, right? We have to do something to get to Ve'ahavta, right? Ve'ahavta is the commandment to love is not necessarily the commandment like the action itself, but there's a lot that sort of leads us to that, right? Particularly right now we're talking about in terms of God, but we could say the same thing whether we're talking about God or our neighbor or the stranger. It's the actions that we take that are expressions, right, of love, or it might be sort of circular, right? It's like if you do the thing out of kindness and out of care and protection and compassion, right? Even if you are not feeling the feeling, right? Perhaps that will come back. So, but Rambam here is saying, like, meditate upon and closely examine God's mitzvot, God's utterances, teachings, right? And God's actions in the world. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It doesn't necessarily only mean do God's mitzvot and you will come to love God through that, but actually spend time thinking about God, right? Spend time trying to understand God. And sort of, if we think for a moment, Hal was starting to take us into like, well, what is love, right? If we take this outside of God and into interpersonal love for a moment, so then how would we translate that? Feel free to put something in the chat instead of speaking this one out loud, right? So if Rambam's telling us that love, the commandment to love or getting to love or loving, right, is thinking about, contemplating, right, meditating on for the purpose of understanding. I think we can see that, right, in our interpersonal relationships, whether that's friendships or strangers, right, or a romantic relationship or a partnership of any kind, right? To know someone, right, is to then open oneself to love and loving that person, and all kinds of love, right? I just want to make sure, when I say loving another person, I'm not just speaking about, romantic or life partnership, right? So let's see. So if we jump down a little bit, he says, from this, it is clear that meditation will lead to understanding, and then a feeling of enjoyment and love will follow automatically. So this last paragraph, if anyone would read the last paragraph of that third text, so before Yoma 86a, where it says our sages, and I will pull it up for us again, because I know that makes it easier for some folks. So right here, if someone would jump in and read, our sages also said.
Our sages also said that this mitzvah includes calling out to all humankind to serve God, exalted be God, and to believe in God. This is because when you love a person, for example, you praise that person and call out to others to draw close to the person. So too, if you truly love God, through your understanding and realization of God's true existence, you will certainly spread this true knowledge that you know to be ignorant and the foolish.
All right, so I love that last part because it's so obnoxious. That you'll spread the knowledge to the ignorant and to the foolish, right? So we can leave that aside. I didn't want to cut it because it was what he wrote, though I did cut other things, but that just, that was the end of the sentence. So, so what is this last paragraph offering us, right? Beyond our own understanding, meditation, contemplation of God's words, mitzvot, works, actions in the world, what does this paragraph give us? What's it about? Yeah, Kate.
I'm not even sure if I'm right here, but some of the thoughts that are going through my head is if you are saying in your actions or your words, how good someone is and how wonderful they are, then other people will see that as well. you know, I have to say this, and I know it's going to sound really silly, but we raise guide dog puppies. And and we raise it with positive reinforcement. So all day you're saying, good girl, good boy, good girl, good boy. And there are inmates in prisons who are raising some of these dogs now. And here are people who have said, I never heard good boy in my entire life. And if someone had said that to me the way I'm saying to my puppy all day long, I may have been a totally different person. You know, and I think it's acknowledging the goodness in others. And when you acknowledge that goodness, not only do you acknowledge it for that person, but you're opening your own heart at the same time. I don't know if that makes sense here or not, but it was one of the thoughts that were running through my head.
Yeah. And I'm seeing Matt's comment. Yep, I think that's right. Not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm going to go over to Wayne.
So when I read this, the first part at least, it sounds like it's a commandment to proselytize, which I thought we really don't do as Jews.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the quote, what I cut off at the end was it continues to talk about Abraham, who made souls, right, where he was in Haran, and he took those souls with him. And the understanding there is, you know, he told people about God, right? So proselytizing, like when you say proselytize, what does that mean?
Well, it's to tell others to follow what you're doing. It's to, I mean, I think of the image of people going door to door trying to talk someone into believing in their God.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that wasn't part of what we do as Jews. We let the food speak for itself. We don't have to talk people into it.
Yeah, you know, and if somebody traditionally, if somebody does want to become Jewish, right, then, you know, our tradition says there is a tradition, an idea that we're supposed to, you know, turn them away a few times, and then they have to, you know, sort of insist that this is something that they want to do. So it's kind of interesting, right? This mitzvah includes calling out to all humankind to serve God and to believe in God. There's some, so yes, that's one stream, right, or one concept in Judaism, but then there's others that are like, it's our job to help bring people to understanding the oneness of God, right? So I think you're noting something important. If we wanted to, we could read this as a little bit less active, perhaps, not like going out and drawing people in and saying, come and believe what I believe, but a little bit more like, you know, I'm going to talk about someone who I care deeply about because they're special to me and they're important to me, not because I need the person listening to me to also love them necessarily, right? But it's going to happen, right? And I think, you know, people who and I'm sure we all know people like this who like, they love something so deeply and they just talk about it all the time. And maybe it's because they want you to join them in their love, but I wouldn't say that they're proselytizing. So it's kind of an interesting thing to figure out where's that line, but this turns it outward, right? So it's not just v'ahavta, here's your commandment, or here's how you should contemplate, or you should think, or you should understand, but actually there's something really beautiful and important about spreading the love a little bit more widely as well. I'm gonna go over to Arlene since you haven't spoken yet.
Well, I think two things. I think, I just attended the Minyan Tzedek meeting on Monday, and they had a reverend, I think that our partnership we have with LA Voice, it has like 50 synagogues, you know, the Muslims and the Christians, and his whole thing was for all of us to work together so that we have the same goals of like the homeless and everything with the community, and that we don't feel like we're separate. We have similar goals and to create relationships. So I see that as a really, really big part, that would be the ideal text to use, you know. And the other thing I see is the idea of that we're supposed to be a light of, you know, for other nations. And if people, you know, if we lived in communities and people, you know, saw what the Judaism was like and the love of the God, there wouldn't be so much fear of maybe anti-Semitism, that we are the other and the stranger.
Right. And I think one thing that's important as we're thinking about multi-faith work is how to come together in our shared values. Just going back to what Alexandra said at the very beginning, like if our understanding of God includes our understanding of oneness, right, then that helps draw us together and maybe makes this less about proselytizing Judaism and more about the values and the unity, right, that we, the wholeness and the oneness that we might want to advocate, even if different people find their path there through different religions, let's say, right? Yes. Okay. So, yeah, just reading the chat as we go. Okay. So I will, let's see, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to go to Leah and Alexandra, if you can keep it brief, and then we're going to keep going.
Okay. I think that we're trained in a Western model to see it as like a wishing well or a bank. I do something good and then I'll get something good. I do something bad, I'll get something bad. But here we're being invited to meditate on God's works, God's actions, commandments, for understanding and realization of true existence, which might be that we're stretched. Oh, this too? Cat peed on the bed? This too? I have to take this in too as part of the oneness of God. And if I can do that and bring that to my own actions, that's going to make me look very different than if I'm in a continual state of, oh no, this can't be right. This can't be right. Because I'm such a good person. How could this bad thing happen to me? I think we're really called upon to expand our ideas of oneness, the oneness of God.
Yeah, yeah, right. That conditional thing, it's interesting because in Pirkei Avot, we're not going to scroll down right now, but it says all love that depends on something, when the thing ceases, the love ceases, right? So I think, you know, the rabbis, and all love that does not depend on anything will not cease. And so if it's just about understanding God and seeing oneness and holding, you know, if it's, then that's different, right? Then I think maybe a more like when I have X, Y, and Z, right? When I experience these good things. And I don't think any of us would sort of see, I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of people bristle when they think about prayer as like the thing you do when you need something, right? And yet I do imagine that for a lot of people, there's still some element of struggling with what you're describing, right? Of being able to see the oneness when it's good, and then not necessarily having that top of mind when things are a little bit harder. Okay, Alexandra.
I love Leah's comment. And it sort of ties into one of the things I wanted to say, which was in the Torah, and I can't remember where, I'm sure there are many people here who will remember it much better than I do, but there's a point where it says, like, if you love God, if you love all of this, like the darkness and the light, the good and the bad, that is your path back to God. And so that's pretty much exactly what Leah said. And also I think that proselytizing, there's a difference between talking about God and encouraging people to experiment with God as a tool for personal transformation versus talking about you need to be a Jew. That's a very different thing, because one of the things that's so great about Judaism is like you don't have to be a Jew to be a good person. You don't have to be a Jew to connect with God. And so I think that, to me, the line is where between proselytizing and encouraging like a connection to that which makes us greater and bigger and better and happier and you need to be a Jew at the end of that stage.
Yeah, I think that's right. And even, you know, somebody brought up the idea of being a light to the nations, right? I think maybe light with, right? I think, you know, sort of holding that understanding, you know, as Arlene also talked about, the interfaith work and sort of lifting up one another's faiths and the, what we're called to do. And yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, as Sefer HaMitzvot said, right, like when you love someone, you're just going to talk about them, and that's going to let other people know about how wonderful they are, right, and sort of bring them along, or maybe inspire them to something different that's not exactly like your actions, right, but I don't know, elevates the general idea of love. Yes, thank you, Matt. I see that I know that I'm still screen sharing. I'm going to go to Yoma, and then I'll stop the share for right now. A couple minutes of reflection on this one. So this is from the Talmud, from the Babylonian Talmud, Yoma 86a. Abaye said, it was taught, as we know, you shall love the Lord your God. And then this teaching says, you shall make the name of heaven beloved. Okay, love. So this is similar, right? It's outward facing. Make the name of heaven beloved. It's about you, but it's also about other people. How do you do it? Read Torah, learn Mishnah, serve Torah scholars, and be pleasant with people in your business transactions. So if I were to ask you, how do you make the name of heaven beloved, right? And you ask you to put yourself in the Talmud shoes, right? Put yourself in 500 to 800 CE rabbi shoes, although this is an earlier text, so pre-200 CE rabbi shoes, you probably would have gone with the Torah and the Mishnah. That's a little bit they're writing the Mishnah, and so then they tell you to study the Mishnah. It seems a little funny, right? Serve Torah scholars also. I don't know about that. If I told you as a rabbi, what would really be holy is serving a rabbi. That seems a little bit suspect, but what I love is this last one: be pleasant with people in your business transactions, right? That makes the name of heaven beloved. That is part of what it means to love Adonai, your God. So what do people say about that person? Oh, fortunate is this person's parent, and I didn't change any of genders on this one. I apologize. I changed them on other texts, but for this one, kind of left it as is. Fortunate is this person's parent who taught them Torah. Fortunate is his teacher who taught them Torah. Woe to the people who have not studied Torah. So-and-so who taught them Torah. Look how pleasant are his ways, how proper are his deeds. When he reads Torah, so this is also pretty powerful. When he reads Torah, learns Mishnah, and serves Torah scholars, but his business practices are not done faithfully, and he does not speak pleasantly with other people, woe to so-and-so who studied Torah. Woe to their parent who taught him Torah. Woe to the teacher who taught him Torah. This person, how destructive are his deeds and how ugly are his ways. I get the second part, even though I've seen this, as people are quoting just the first, right? To say, what does it mean to love God? And what does it mean to not love God, right? So I'm going to stop the share on this one, but any reflections or thoughts about that text that we just looked at? What does it mean to love God according to that teaching? Yeah, Hal/Kathy. Oh, still muted?
Yeah, no, I love this. It's sort of like instruction for the rest of us, who aren't Torah scholars or whatever. And I think, one of my maxims that I try to live up to and often fail is simply don't be an asshole. And I think this kind of epitomizes that philosophy. You can take God out of it and just say, don't be an a-hole. And, I think that's, anyways. So.
Good. That sounds great. However, Hal, I'm going to push back because that's not the only thing it says in this text. It doesn't say, how do you love God? By dealing faithfully in business and being good to other people. It doesn't only say that, right? It says that. And I think especially, as people committed to justice and goodness and all of that, we value that. That's important. But what else does it say?
It says study, but the point is, if you do all of that and you don't do the other, then you've failed.
Yes, right? If you study Torah diligently, if you study Mishnah, but you don't do the interpersonal stuff, then you're actually not fulfilling V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, right? That's really amazing.
Yeah.
Right? That this is defining that mitzvah as it's defining it as all of those things. It's and this is similar to something that we saw at the beginning, right? That text from Lutzato where he says, you know, love is underlying everything, but this isn't separating love. It's saying acting, study, different kind of study, right? Mishnah being, I think, more about the law, right? Like more about understanding not just Torah, but also the halakha, the Jewish law, right? But the interpersonal business and pleasantness, right? It's not only just letter of the law. It's like, be nice, like be pleasant, right? Those are the definitional pieces, according to this understanding of what it means to love God. All the more so, right? If loving God includes those interpersonal and business mitzvot, so of course we can imagine how that translates into loving our neighbor and loving the stranger. Yeah, David.
It feels to me not individualistic. Well, when I'm reading about parents and I'm reading about teachers, even business transactions, I think God is very involved and desirous of perpetuating his creation rather than individuals. And this feels very generational to me. If you want humanity to survive, and if you want this world to keep going, this is how you do it. This is generations. It feels that that's where God is concerned.
Well, and interesting you say that because Shema, the Ahavta, that paragraph, right, is about teaching the next generation and the next generation after that, right? So I think that it makes sense as a link as well, that there's some bigger picture going on. All right, Matt.
I started studying Torah because I was interested in the text and the history and stuff. And I've discovered doing this study does help me be a better person. That, to my shock and surprise, I was learning better ways to think about how to treat other people. You know, Mishnah is legalistic, but there's a legalism in there that really is satisfying. It's not, this is the law, but these are the ways you have to care about other people when applying the law. These are considerations you need to make. So again, that surprised me that I got there.
That came out for you. So thank you. So we only have a couple of minutes left. So what I'd like to take a moment and do is, you know, just sort of take a step back, right? The questions that came up from the very beginning, and how can we be commanded to love? What does it mean to be commanded to love God, right? What does that look like? How are we supposed to understand it? And so I'd like to just take a moment and ask you if you have one takeaway from our learning together today, whether that's specifically about relationship to God, about love, or about expanding this idea or these ideas to interpersonal relationships. I would love it if you would put it in the chat. If you want to just send it to me, I'd be happy to see it anyway, just to see where people's reflections are. But Wayne, I was working on like, what song title do I use for my source sheet? It had to be something. There were options, you know. All we need is love depends on how you define love. I'm just gonna say, right? Not just a feeling. I think that's, you know, that's a big thing of where we started from. And I will say, you know, just for fun, you know, we didn't really make the transition to thank you, Alexandra. Things I didn't expect to be coming up as mantras and maxims. Yeah, right, good. Multi-directions, right? Love, actions, love. And also that they are they're self-perpetuating. There's just this beautiful teaching at the end. We didn't sort of explore more in the text about loving your neighbor, loving the stranger, etc. But there's just a lovely text at the end that you are welcome to read at the end on your own from Eric Fromm about the nature of love. And I'll just read this as you keep typing. and it does and doesn't fit with some of the other stuff we talked about. Love is not primarily a relationship to a specific person. It is an attitude, an orientation of character, which determines the relatedness of a person to the world as a whole, not towards one object of love. If a person loves only one other person and is indifferent to the rest of his fellow men, his love is not love, but a symbiotic attachment or an enlarged egotism, etc., etc. Because one does not see that love is an activity, a power of the soul. One believes that all that is necessary is to find the right object, and that everything it goes by itself afterwards, right? It's like wanting to learn how to paint, but waiting for the right thing that you're going to paint that will help you become a great painter, right? As opposed to actually learning, doing, manifesting in the world, and actually making it something about a way of being. So I am grateful to all of you for participating in this conversation, for exploring this concept. I think we would all agree on one thing, which is that this requires action, right? Whether we're talking about loving God or we're talking about love towards others, there's action, and that action includes trying to know another person. I think about something really lovely that I learned about empathy, and that curiosity is the opening to empathy, right? Wanting to know somebody allows us to connect with them. So I will close with that. Next week, Dr. Jody Myers is teaching. She's wonderful, and just grateful to get to sub in for Rabbi Kasher this week. Hope to get to learn with all of you in different ways very soon. Thank you, and thank you, Tzvi, for being behind the scenes. Please unmute yourselves, say hello.